Hello, hi everyone. Welcome back to Woo Can Cook. My name is Wesley, and this is a show where we are slowly cooking our way through all of the food from my childhood. Today we're diving back into our series dedicated to Japanese classics with yet another variation at one of my very favorite dishes of all time, which is a sesame paste noodle or tantan ramen. Those following along with this channel should hopefully have noticed by now that we have done just so many versions of dandan noodles now. In past months, this has included a peanut butter version, a cold tofu version, a vegan version, a traditional Sichuan version, a Thai rice noodle version, and now finally, at long last, a Japanese ramen version. The reason, of course, that we have done so many iterations is because dandan noodles transcend many different food cultures, which makes sense because it is conceptually pretty simple. Sesame paste has a thick, dense texture to it, so it in turn yields a thick, luxurious sauce to coat your noodles. What's particularly fascinating to me, though, is when we take a closer look at how each variation is also unique to its own food culture. For today's tantan ramen, as you might have guessed, we'll be pairing some fresh ramen noodles with a sesame paste-based ramen broth. Then to round this out, a tantan ramen soup base is traditionally thickened up with a non-dairy milk as well. Today I'll be using some fresh Chinese soy milk for a thicker and more dense sauce, but I'll also be diving into the benefits of using these more readily available Western alternatives like oat milk or almond milk too. Okay, so let's get into it.
Every time that I try to write this song, every time I end up a little bit more lost. 'Cause all around I see chaos.
Okay, so kicking things off here first, I'm starting off with some aromatic veggies for our ground pork stir fry that you'll often see forming the fundamental building blocks of umami. This is 4 cloves of crushed and minced garlic to start, followed by 1 inch or about 1 tablespoon of fine minced ginger, and the whites of 3 green onions sliced up thinly. Then we're going to take these more delicate greens of our green onions, slice them up thinly on a bias, and set them aside to use raw as our finishing garnish later on. Next up, for the vegetable element of our tantan ramen today, this is about 4 to 6 ounces of baby bok choy that I'm slicing into halves. You'll find that baby bok choy is a little bit less bitter than its full-grown counterpart, although in a pinch, either will work just fine here. Moving on to my ground pork topping next, I'm gonna go ahead and borrow the marinade from our Sichuan dandan mian recipe here, which leans pretty heavily on the use of dark soy sauce to create its richer and more deeply umami-based qualities. This is 4 tablespoons of soy sauce and a single tablespoon of sesame oil here to start, followed by some acids to help tenderize our pork today. This is gonna be 1 tablespoon each of Japanese rice wine or mirin and rice vinegar. Then next is a half teaspoon each of white pepper and cornstarch, followed finally as promised by our single tablespoon of dark soy sauce to round everything out. I'm mixing this all up until combined, then setting it aside to marinate for 30 minutes while we dive into our soup base next. Alright, so diving into our ramen broth here, I'm starting off with 2 cups of Japanese dashi stock. Dashi is a soup base made from anchovy and sea kelp and is a great source of fishy umami. Failing this though, I also think that plain old chicken or vegetable stock will work just fine here too. Then going into my pot here next are a few elements to help us build a nice complex ramen broth. Up first is 4 tablespoons of soy sauce to start, followed once again by a single tablespoon each of Japanese mirin and rice vinegar. Then next I'm adding just a single tablespoon of brown sugar for a touch of sweetness, followed finally by our heat elements. I'm doing this today using some of the chili crisp oil that we make at our pop-up, which we call the good shit. And if you're looking for it, we also dove into greater detail on how to make that in our Sichuan dandan mian recipe as well. If not, you can also buy the stuff off the shelf in a jar too though, so if you don't feel like making it yourself, this will also serve you just fine. Although I do think that our recipe is a little bit less salty and a little bit more prominently highlights the Sichuan peppercorn than most jarred stuff does. Finally, I'm rounding this all out with a single tablespoon of chili bean paste or doubanjiang. Then I'm mixing this all up to combine and we're heading over to the stove. Over on the stove, I'm kicking things off here first with our noodles and bok choy, which will need a brief par cook today. I've got a pot of boiling water going on here, then I'm parboiling my ramen noodles and bok choy for 2 minutes until tender, then immediately straining and removing from heat. I'm using some fresh ramen noodles here, but if you can't find these, the plain old dry pantry stuff is gonna do just fine too. Then next up, moving on to our wok fry, I've switched out my pot for my wok here, then I'm reheating as hot as possible, adding 4 tablespoons of peanut oil, and as always, long yao for that nice non-stick surface. Then going in here first are my aromatic veggies. This is my garlic, ginger, and the whites of my green onions, going in for about 15 seconds until nice and fragrant. Then I'm following this up with my marinated ground pork, which we're sauteing for about 2 to 3 minutes using my spatula to break up any clumps until a saucy, pebbly ground pork topping begins to form, like so. Moving on to my ramen broth next, I've cleaned out my wok and reheated over medium-low heat this time. Then I'm adding in my soup base here and bringing it up to a gentle simmer. Then going in next here, as promised, is 2 cups of fresh Chinese soy milk, which we're letting simmer for 20 minutes. Now, I decided to go with Chinese soy milk today, partly because it's readily accessible for me here in Chinatown, but also because it's thicker than your more standard Western soy milk. The tricky part with this though is that this stuff also separates very easily when mixed with vinegars, not unlike our soup base today. We also ran into a similar result with our savory doujiang youtiao recipe a while back as well, and according to my mom, it is a very normal thing to come across with Chinese soy milk recipes. If you don't want this to happen in your tantan ramen though, you can also simply go with a Western alternative like oat milk, almond milk, or even Western soy milk, and the thinner texture to these milks should help you avoid the issue, although as you might guess, your ramen will not be quite as thick in texture. In any case, once we're done letting this simmer, I'm combining my soup base with 3 tablespoons of sesame paste off heat and mixing until combined. Here we can see that soy milk starting to separate a little bit more distinctly too. Once it's combined, I'm serving this all up with a portion of ramen here to start, followed by my ramen broth and a nice portion of bok choy on the side. Then finally, here's my ground pork filling on top, followed by my greens of my green onions to finish, and we're ready to eat. Okay, so I'll be the first to acknowledge that I am absolutely a sucker for pretty much any form of sesame noodle from really any culture. This, of course, is probably why we have done something like 6 or 7 versions of this dish by now. I do, however, want to point out that this is definitely one of the more unique versions that I have done, and is probably the version that is most radically different from the Sichuan dandanmians that I'm most familiar with. To start with the obvious, it's a soup, but also I think that the dashi stock gives us a more distinctly unique form of fishy umami that you would not come across in a Szechuan dandanmian. Then our soup base is also deeply rich and flavorful from our long simmer, largely assisted by our homemade chili crisp oil, and if you've got some extra time to make this stuff yourself, I highly recommend it because it's reasonably fridge stable and also beats the pants off of really any jarred chili oil that I've ever had. Finally, the last bit that I'll mention is that I've spent my entire childhood eating and drinking separated Chinese soy milk like this, and I have largely gotten used to the texture of it, but I also know that it's not for everyone though, so if you've got some almond milk hanging around left over from your breakfast cereal, I'm definitely on board with swapping this stuff in as needed, and it won't separate nearly as much on you. Okay, so that's it everyone. I hope you enjoyed this and I hope you give this one a shot. For those who are new to the channel, this one is part of a larger series that's dedicated to Japanese classic dishes, so definitely check out that series next if you haven't yet because there's a lot of these. For the Bay Area locals, the Wu Can Cook fried rice pop-up is now at Wonders Brewing in Emeryville every Thursday through Sunday, so come by and say hi then if you can. More about that at wucancook.com/eats. Also a fun update, we've got t-shirts. I'm super excited to be partnering with my good friends at Pollywog Prints to make these super sweet Wu Can Cook t-shirts. They're super soft and comfortable and also have a picture of me on the back, which is crazy. We're selling these at the Wu Can Cook pop-up at Wonders Brewing, or you can head over to wucancook.com/shop to grab one of these from the online store too. As always, like, comment, subscribe, share, be nice interneters, and I'll see you soon. Bye.
Do you feel the